deal has always said that the nuclear issue would be dealt with later rather than sooner.
Right.
So there have been no agreements on the nuclear dimension of this memorandum. That comes later. And I would imagine that the Iranians will be quite accommodating on the nuclear issue because that will allow them to benefit on all sorts of other issues. But I think that President Trump's comments are sort of premature. And I think what's going on here is he's trying to put lipstick on a pig. The fact is that the United States has lost this war. And if you look at the deal that's on the table and where we're headed, it's clear that the Iranians have won. And for President Trump to admit that is well nigh impossible. So what he's trying to do is prove he's a tough guy and we're going to get our way on a lot of key issues. And we should expect more of that moving forward. But the fact is that if we get a deal, the outlines of that deal at this point in time are very clear. Well, all you have to do is look at the state of the international economy, and you have to look at what's happening to our petroleum reserves in the United States. The president has made this clear himself. He has said that we are facing, quote unquote, an economic catastrophe if we don't shut this war down. He's explicitly said that he doesn't want to be Herbert Hoover II. He fully understands that this war just has to be shut down. There's a set of economic imperatives at play here. You want to ask yourself, why is it that President Trump is willing to sign on to an agreement where we lose on almost every count and the Iranians win on almost every count? They come out of this agreement much better off than they were going into the war. Why did this happen? And the answer is the international economy. And to take it a step further, if you look at the conflict that's now taking place between the United States and Israel, mainly over southern Lebanon, it's quite clear that what has caused President Trump, for the first time in his presidency, to play real hardball with the Israelis is the fact that he's staring an economic catastrophe in the face, and he wants to avoid that at all costs. And in those circumstances, he's willing to be really tough with the Israelis. Well, Vance understands, much like Trump, that we just have to get a deal. And Vance is the point man here. And I think that we should all hope that Vance succeeds and that Trump succeeds. I mean, we've all been extremely critical, and I'm choosing my words carefully here. We've been extremely critical of the decision to launch this war and wage it the way we did up to now. It was a huge mistake, but the president and the vice president fully recognize the error of their ways, and they're trying to repair the problem and fix this before the international economy goes off a cliff. And I applaud them for that, and I just hope that they solve the problem. If they don't solve the problem and we enter into a Great Depression like the one we had in the 1930s, the economic consequences of this will be huge, especially around the world in poor countries. Lots of people will die, and it'll have devastating consequences for the American economy, and none of us want that. So we should hope, in my opinion, that Trump and Vance, who have now reversed direction, are able to shut this one down. It's obviously going to be a messy process. How could it be otherwise when you're involved with President Trump, who's shooting off all these tweets that say outrageous things from time to time? He'll make it as messy as he possibly can. But I think in the end, we have an imperative to shut this one down. And I think the Iranians also have an imperative to shut this one down. And I think there's a good chance. One wouldn't want to say it's 100% guaranteed by any means, but I think we do have a good chance of coming up with some sort of meaningful settlement to this war.
Professor, Israel is very, very, very unhappy that there are talks going on at all, that there's even a possibility of a negotiated settlement along the lines of what is being contemplated. What is your response to people who would, say to you and to me and to Sagar, you people say that the Israel lobby controls everything and we're just their puppets. And here you have Trump going directly against what the Israelis want over their vociferous objections created creating a complete political crisis for Netanyahu and an existential crisis for the Israeli state as a whole. Weren't you wrong about your assessment of how much influence the Israel lobby has in the United States?
Up until very recently, there's no question that the lobby had a lockhold on U.S. Middle East policy. There's no question about that. But what has changed here is that we got into this war, and it's quite clear that as a result of the war and what Iran has done in terms of shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, that they have the ability to wreck the international economy. And that is a threat that is so great that for the first time in President Trump's second and first term in office, and for the first time in any recent president's experience, we are seeing a president really bring down the hammer on the Israelis. And I would imagine that as we move forward and it becomes clearer and clearer that this one has to be shut down for economic reasons, President Trump and Vice President Vance will go to even greater lengths to be tough on the Israelis. So this is an anomalous situation, and it's caused by extraordinary circumstances, in particular, the threat of a Great Depression.
Well, something that we think is absolutely fascinating, sir, was throughout the war, it became very clear about the role of the U.S. dollar throughout this. The petrodollar, of course, has always been a long subject of analysis and of explanation. However, we also saw that China and Iran, via use of crypto or denominating these tolls that they were charging in the middle of the war, were able to bring them some revenue. The recent clues in the U.S. Treasury sanctions, let's put A3 up here on the screen, seem like a clawback at trying to have at least some of the dominance that we previously had before the war, where the most recent interesting part of the primary sanctions relief actually allows Iran not only to sell its oil, but to actually allow those settlement of transactions in dollars. It means that Chinese buyers could pay Iran in dollars. It also even means that American refineries could buy any Iranian petrochemical products. What do you make here of the U.S. attempt to try and to reverse some of the damage to the global oil market and what Iran revealed about U.S. sanctions throughout this entire war?
Well, first of all, you want to remember that at the start of this war, when the bombing campaign was taking place, we were allowing Iranian tankers to come out of the Gulf and sell their oil on global markets. And the reason is quite straightforward. We needed all the oil we could get on global markets. And it wasn't until President Trump put the blockade on the strait that we cut off, in large part, the flow of Iranian oil into global markets. Now, what's different here is that they can sell those barrels of oil in dollars, and that's different. And the question you want to ask yourself is, why is President Trump doing this? And the answer is, in large part, because Iran won the war. And this is one of their demands. We simply have no choice if we want to shut this war down. The Iranians have made a number of demands. It's quite amazing how many demands they've made that we have agreed to. And this is one of them. But furthermore, this works to our advantage because it gets more oil out into global markets and it keeps the price of oil down. So that's a good thing.
So let's say that the negotiations proceed, that the Trump administration and the Iranians are both committed to coming to some sort of a resolution here. What would that deal mean for Israel? How would it impact their current orientation? How would they have to change the way that they've been operating?
Well, I would make 2 points here. First of all, overall, the deal is a disaster for Israel. This is widely recognized in Israel. And the fact is that Israel thought that Iran was its gravest enemy and that this war would put an end to Iran's nuclear program. It would end nuclear enrichment. It would greatly weaken Iran, and it would put Israel in a catbird seat in the Middle East. That has obviously not happened. Iran is going to emerge from this war in much better shape than it was on February 27th, the day before the war started. So this is overall a strategic disaster for Israel. Then you get to the particular issue of Lebanon. And the Israelis want the freedom to, number one, keep their forces in southern Lebanon, which they're now occupying. Number two, have the freedom to bomb Lebanon whenever they see fit. And the Iranians have told us you have to get the Israelis completely out of southern Lebanon, and you have to put an end to their bombing of Lebanon. If we succeed in doing that, that would be a devastating defeat for the Israelis. And they talk about that all the time in their press. So it's quite clear that this war and the agreement that we reach with the Iranians to end this war could have devastating consequences, not just across the board, but in particular on the issue of Lebanon.
Yeah, zooming out, sir, something I really saw was part of the reason why this seems such a disaster for Israel is it fundamentally just destroys their primary ambition, which is to be the sole regional hegemon. If you have Iran, which is unsanctioned and does receive this $300 billion in funds, some $120 billion of which is already theirs, in addition to tens of billions of dollars a month from the sale of oil, its GDP per capita, I checked in 2024, a rump economy, heavily sanctioned, was $437 billion, only $100 billion or so total off of Israel. A reconstructed Iran, which is allowed to sell oil on the global market with some significant investment, 90 million people, could easily surpass Israel in a matter of a decade, and in multiple decades could become a regional superpower in its own right. How do you think that will shift the global balance of power whenever it comes to the Middle East, let's say with China, with India, and many of these other nations, which are just balancing these things on its face, and they don't have their own neoconservative lobbies?
Well, if you look at the principal indicators of latent power, and here we're talking about population size and wealth, the Iranians have about 93 million people, and I would estimate that there are about 7.3 million Israeli Jews. There are also about 7.3 million Palestinians inside Greater Israel, but even if you add them into the mix, that's still about 14.6 million people, and that's a lot smaller than 93 million. And then if you look at the human capital in Iran, which is a really good indicator of their potential for generating wealth, they have very impressive human capital. So there's no question that this is a country with a very large population and the capability to generate a lot of wealth. And it would, in the end, I think, be much more powerful than Israel would be. I think from Israel's point of view, and if you listen to the Israelis talk, this is quite clear. The two countries they worry the most about are Turkey and Iran, because they both have large populations and they have impressive amounts of human capital. So the idea that Israel is going to become a regional hegemon in the Middle East begins to look like a flawed argument when you take into account Iran and Turkey. But I would also add to this, if you look at what's happened to Israel since October 7th, Israel is a big mess today. They did not defeat Hezbollah. Hezbollah is really giving them fits in southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah is not going to be knocked out. It's going to be a perennial foe. Furthermore, they did not defeat Hamas. They inflicted enormous pain on Hamas, but Hamas is still in the fight in a major way. They're in a mess in the West Bank. They're in a mess in Syria. And if you look at what's happening in terms of all the centrifugal forces that are at play inside of Israel, it looks like a very depressing picture from an Israeli point of view. So Israel today is in really terrible shape, putting aside the whole question of the future vis-a-vis Iran and Turkey.
I think the 10-point plan was an achievement in itself. The very fact the Americans accepted it as a framework for negotiation. They didn't accept the 10-point plan, but it was a huge achievement because the Americans started with unconditional surrender, and after 39 days ended with, okay, we'll accept your 10-point plan as the framework for discussions. And of course, it was obvious that they would once at the negotiating table, they would refrain from accepting the plan. But the Americans made a bigger mistake, in my opinion, after the war. The war itself was a catastrophic mistake and a major victory for Iran, a key victory, a turning point in the world that we live in today. But what became even more, I think, devastating for the United States was what happened after the war. We were supposed to have a ceasefire, and if Netanyahu was smart, he wouldn't have wrecked it. He carpet bombed Lebanon in order to wreck the ceasefire. This was more than 2 months ago. And I know you remember, but just in case some of your viewers have forgotten. So because of Netanyahu, the ceasefire plan crashed, and the Strait of Hormuz continued to remain closed for those countries that helped the United States in the war. It was never closed for everyone. The Iranians closed it to the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, and the Qataris for their role in the war. So, and that caused the price of energy and LNG and all the other petrochemical products to rise. But after the failure of the ceasefire and then the U.S. siege on Iranian ports, the situation for the entire world got a lot worse. So if the Americans had been smart, if Netanyahu had not wrecked the peace or the ceasefire agreement, right now the United States would not be in this position. Netanyahu single-handedly, and then Trump through the siege on Iranian ports, really made things a lot worse for them. Because losing the war was one thing, but crashing the economy is something else. So ultimately, the Americans backed down. They thought that they'll strangle Iran, starve the Iranian people, bring them to their knees, and then, they were swiftly using strategic oil reserves and talking down the markets, ironically keeping consumption high and pushing us faster and faster towards the crisis. But in any case, they were hoping that they would defeat Iran and no one and ordinary Americans would not experience very high oil prices and energy prices, and it would be over. But it didn't happen. Iran didn't fold. Iran remained very steadfast, and the Americans, they folded. So we had the negotiations for the MOU. And ultimately, it was becoming clear that the Americans they needed an urgent agreement, but they were still dragging their feet until Netanyahu struck Beirut, southern Beirut, and the Iranians were going to retaliate. And Trump said, "Okay, we'll give you these concessions for the MOU," and there was an agreement. The MOU is pretty good. Of course, there's a big controversy in Iran about the MOU. Some people are against it, some for it. The leader, it turned out, we didn't know, but in the negotiations, it turned out that he was not in agreement with everything in the MOU or the way they chose to, let's say, formulate the MOU. There are some elements of it which are still unclear. It's for people, it's unclear to exactly what it is that he was opposed to, but he agreed to the MOU ultimately, even though he wasn't completely happy with it. But he agreed to allow the Supreme National Security Council to approve of the MOU. So there is a controversy in Iran. Some say we should have taken a harder stance. Some say that, well, this was approved, so we should just be tough at the negotiating table. Personally, I think the reason why the leader let it be known that he was critical of some elements of the MOU was because he was sending a message to Americans that his negotiators are not going to be flexible, that they've already conceded what as much as is going to be conceded. If you get what I'm trying to say here. In other words, The MOU was agreed upon. He said, I'm not completely satisfied with it. And so that's sending a message both to the negotiators, but more importantly to the Americans, that don't try to get any concessions from the Iranians at the negotiating table. This is it. This is the MOU. You have to fulfill it. At the negotiating table, even though Vance and Trump said a lot of nonsense, but it does seem to be clear that the Iranians continue to have the upper hand. So the MOU is pretty good, and so far the Americans have lifted the siege. They've lifted the sanctions on Iran's oil and energy sector for exports. It has the mechanism to free Iranian assets has begun, although the Americans say that Iran has to buy U.S. agricultural goods, but that's not true. And also the Israeli regime has been forced to end its genocide in Lebanon, although they did murder 2 people yesterday. But so far it's pretty clear that the Iranians are not going to be flexible at all, and I think it's clear that they won't be in future. So there is progress. The Iranians did not agree for International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to come to Iran with any new mandate. I mean, they do come to see the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which was never bombed or anything, and the Tehran experimental reactor, which I think you may have visited, or you had an invitation to visit, but you couldn't go. You went? Okay. So that monitors or inspectors still go there. But the sites that were bombed, Iran has not agreed. So what Trump and Vance are saying are basically for internal consumption because of the criticisms that you alluded to in the United States. So far it seems to be moving well. What I can also say is that the Strait of Hormuz during the last few days has been open. The number of ships in general over I don't know how many days it's been since it's open, but the number of ships that have passed through have not been that great, except for two days they were higher, especially the tankers. But a lot of that oil is Iranian oil. So the Iranians have been disproportionately exporting oil. They had a lot of tankers full of oil that were ready to go. And as soon as as soon as the siege was lifted, those many tankers began to leave the region. Many of them were inside the strait. Some of them were outside. But in any case, Iran has been able to export a lot of oil. So this is where we are. But the strait is still, the traffic is not great. Not lots of tankers are coming in. The Iranians have told all the ships that they have to pass through a certain route. So the passage is not there are not that many ships going through. But of course, the tensions when Trump keeps threatening Iran, threatening to kill the negotiators, to murder the negotiators, to destroy Iran, that's obviously not going to create confidence for insurance companies and the owners of tankers that are thinking about sending their ships to the Persian Gulf.
That's what I meant. The threats being made against Iran, this does not conform with the MOU. But also Trump made some comments, that is that Iran wouldn't get 10 cents, but the memorandum speaks of 300 billion for the reconstruction, economic development of Iran. So essentially for the US and its partners to fix what they broke. Also, in one tweet, Trump blamed the Hezbollah for the problems in Lebanon. But I think again here the MOU is quite clear that this is sovereign Lebanese territory, and essentially the Israelis have to go. And as I said, with the claims they also made about the IAEA being allowed in, which Iran considers to have essentially spied for the Israelis and Americans. The agricultural deal, which doesn't seem to exist. There's a lot of these things. And essentially, well, in my mind, I'm left with two possible hypotheses. That is either Trump is trying to water this down, walk it back, or second is it's simply noise. That is, it's a very unpopular deal back in America. He promised the unconditional surrender of Iran. He was going to destroy them. He reassured everyone, we're winning. And suddenly, this looks like a deal of surrender almost. That is, they didn't get anything they wanted, and it reflects realities on the battlefield. So, I'm not going to criticize the Americans for signing this when I assume this is the best deal they could get. But again, for domestic politics, it is possible that they're only making noise while they're gradually accepting the new realities. I was wondering, how do you see this? Is this walking back or just making noise for the domestic audience?
I think they're definitely trying to walk back, but the Iranians won't let them. They're very tough and at the negotiating table, and they want the full implementation of the MOU. And Ayatollah Khamenei's letter was, as I said, a message to the Americans that we're not going to be flexible. This was agreed upon, and this is the only option, either fulfillment of the agreement or nothing. And so far, I mean, there's a long way to go, especially with regards to Lebanon, because Netanyahu will do anything possible to wreck the agreement. And the murder of two young Lebanese men yesterday who were just trying to fix a road that was destroyed was intentional. They killed these men in order to undermine the agreement. It was no accident. So the Israeli regime is, and as we speak, they've been intensifying the slaughter in Gaza and the crimes in the West Bank, I guess, to fulfill the bloodlust of Israelis who are unhappy about the forced silence of the guns in Lebanon. So the fact that the siege has been lifted, the fact that the U.S. has officially waived the sanctions, and the fact that there was an agreement signed between Iran and Qatar on the sidelines of the agreement, I think shows that things are moving forward. And the fact that the Israelis can no longer bomb cities and villages and flatten neighborhoods in Lebanon is a sign that progress is being made. Actually, I've heard, I haven't seen this, but I've heard that 67% of Americans, ordinary Americans, they support this agreement. So the animosity, the anger and the hatred and the criticism largely, I would assume, I haven't seen the details, come from the political class. And that's clear. I mean, the reason is clear because both parties are captured by the Zionist lobby. So the Democrats, even though the base hates the Israeli regime in Congress, in the Senate, and in think tanks, they are overwhelmingly pro-Israel and pro-genocide. So for the time being, you're going to see criticism, which is, of course, valid in the sense that Trump promised victory and came back with defeat. That criticism is valid. But I think that the American population being anti-war and anti a lot of things nowadays that used to be taken for granted that are acceptable. They want this deal because they don't want war.
Well, I also, you see this from the polling though, that the American public are, again, they don't want this war, overwhelmingly so. But often you see always the Americans tend to vote for people who promise, a return to normalcy and end to this war, but they always get the opposite. But that being said, though, because the political system in the U.S. is so polarized, the fact that Trump got a bad deal, many see this as an opportunity to well, knock him over the head with it. So this also puts the deal, I guess, in a weaker position. Well, I know it's not a deal; it's a memorandum of understanding, a deal to make a deal, but nonetheless, this polarization within the U.S., I think this could become a big problem as well. Even people who recognize they have to sign the deal is still too appealing opportunity, too attractive to use against Trump, given that it has been such a failure. But it almost sounds you're a little bit optimistic. It sounds though to this memorandum of understanding, that is that the U.S. is grudgingly so recognizing these new realities. Is that fair to say?
Until now, for the time being, but no, I think that this is the very name of it is it's called an MOU because it's which indicates the fragility of the process, and so I'm not terribly optimistic because of the nature of the U.S. government and the Trump regime and the influence of the Zionist lobby and Netanyahu. So in that regard, I'm not optimistic at all. I don't think based on that, the deal should last very long. But on the other hand, if you look at the situation logically, the shortage of energy, which Trump admitted in public, the approaching energy crisis, he said we have only 4 more weeks of reserves left. Some say it's 4 to 6 weeks, but in any case, the fact that he admitted this, which I found very surprising, and I'm sure many of his advisors were unhappy that he said that aloud, because of course it helps Iran. But I think that if one looks at it logically, therefore, the deal should last, because if it does not last, that means that the energy crisis is going to get much worse. Much worse. And if conflict is renewed, I think that we've discussed this before. I think a global economic depression worse than the 1930s is assured. So I don't know, because the irrationality of and the bloodlust of Zionism and the Zionists is a powerful force. On the other hand, the needs of the global economy, the U.S. economy, should far outweigh that. But I also think that it's not just Trump whose interests are against Netanyahu's. And Netanyahu wants crisis, he wants war. Trump needs peace so that the economy doesn't collapse. But I think probably many people around Netanyahu, and probably many Zionists in the United States, Israeli firsters in the United States, are pragmatic enough to recognize that if the U.S. economy collapses, it would be catastrophic for the Israeli regime too. So it's not as if I'm just guessing, of course, I have no insider knowledge, but I'm assuming that many of these Zionists who are supportive of the genocide and what's going on in Gaza and Lebanon and the West Bank and the wars and all that they too must recognize that this dire economic situation is catastrophic for Israel, because the Israelis are now despised universally, and even in the United States, I think 60% of Americans at least have disapprove of the regime. Add the crisis to that, the fact that people are living with inflation today is one thing, but if the crisis hits like it's expected to do, if the shortages continue, then lives will be ruined, and lifestyles of people, billions of people across the world, will change, and people are going to say it was Netanyahu and Israelis who were behind it. So I think probably pragmatic Zionists in the United States are probably also pushing to prevent the situation from getting worse. So I can't say where this is going to go. I'm not particularly optimistic about the future, but I think until this moment that you and I are speaking, that progress has been made.
Yeah, I was also a bit surprised that Trump could say out loud that yeah, they have 4 weeks left of fuel, because that's admitting quite a desperate situation for the United States. On the other hand, this is almost required if you're going to sign this deal to show, you have to explain why. So you have to show that it's quite desperate. So it's probably not accidental that he blurted this out. But it's also given me some suspicion, though, that if this is the reasoning that they're almost running out of fuel, then it could also be an indication that this is a temporary solution. That is the memorandum of understanding to relieve some pressure, buy some time, and if they can replenish a bit, then start again from a more advantageous position. My last question, though, was just about what you said about Netanyahu. You said that everything he had done had made the situation much worse for the United States. And this is obviously something many people in the US have noticed. They're commenting on it. Well, I guess the main example would be people like Tucker Carlson. But how do you see this developing? Because even if this would be a temporary ploy just to buy time, this kind of new rhetoric you've seen in the US, the open criticism of Israel, the way they're legitimizing Iran nowadays by saying, well, Iran it needs ballistic missiles because its neighbor has. So it's no longer this, terrorist hub masquerading as a country. It's now, a legitimate country with a legitimate interest and has legitimate rights to defend itself. I haven't seen this before in my lifetime rhetoric about Iran. It's refreshing. It's one step towards normalcy. But what does this mean, though? You think for Israel and the greater Israel project? That is, they do have they're put in a very desperate, difficult situation, and one should always be cautious when one's opponent as well is put in a situation where they see few ways out. They can act in a very irrational way if panic sets in. So I was just wondering, how do you see this U.S.-Israeli relationship and what Israel can do next? I mean, it's a lot of its options have fallen away. Keep in mind, knocking out Iran was supposed to usher in the glory days for Israel.
Well, first, I'd like to just add one. Well, first of all, not only did Trump talk about Iranian missiles, but he also said Iran needs nuclear energy for electricity too. So that both of these are quite extraordinary stuff. Just one thing that I'd like to add is that the Iranians are quite aware that the Americans need their energy supplies. And one of the interesting things about the MOU, and I don't know how it was negotiated, I don't know the behind the scenes developments, but the first, the normalization of the strait for business and traffic is in the second month. The first month is I think that that's it. There's like a month. Iran is given a month time to normalize the strait, and that, even though I can't say for certain, but I think that the Iranians will probably use that to make sure that the traffic in the first month doesn't exceed expectations. So I would imagine that the Iranians are going to make sure that the U.S. Shortages remain in place for the foreseeable future, and that its leverage remains intact while allowing trade to flow. But I'm pretty sure that the first month the Iranians are going to have the opportunity to increase pressure. And I think that's the leverage that they have at the negotiating table right now. That's what makes Americans free Iranian assets, lift the sanctions. Otherwise, they'd never do this. We saw in the JCPOA, the nuclear deal of 2015, that when the Iranians carried out their obligations under Trump, the United States refrained from doing so. This time around, the Iranians are making sure that their leverage is intact. So I don't think the Iranians are all that excited about letting as many ships flow through the Strait of Hormuz as possible. And Trump is actually helping by threatening Iran, by saying he'll destroy the country, by saying he'll murder the president or the negotiators. He is also causing concern for, as I said earlier, shipping companies and insurance companies. So I'm not sure if the Iranians are too upset, even though these are all violations of the deal. He cannot make threats. The United States is not allowed to threaten Iran at all during this period. But in a sense, this is hurting the United States more than anything else, because they desperately need ships and shipping companies and insurance companies to feel assured about the future of the Strait of Hormuz. The very nature of this 2-month MOU does not give great assurances. And then to have Trump ranting and raving during this period is going to make things much worse. So I think that leverage is going to remain there for the time being. With regards to the Israeli regime, we've seen this throughout since October the 7th, we've seen this growing hostility towards the regime and towards Zionism across the world. And surprising, in some places, it's quite surprising how even in, for example, India, the dislike is rising towards the Israeli regime, and the same is true in the United States. And what you said about Tucker Carlson is very important in a second way as well, and that is that as you watch Tucker Carlson, you see that a few months ago he began to become very openly critical of the regime, but now it's increasingly becoming hostile, and I think that this is reflective of the growing hostility. So you disapprove, and then you go further, and it becomes entrenched. And this is the foolishness of the Israeli regime by continuing the genocide in Gaza. Just every day they're murdering kids, they're bombing tents, they're bombing teenage girls going to give exams. I mean, the slaughter is endless. And people are seeing this across the world. They're seeing what's happening in Lebanon. Young kids who are just now entering politics, they're entering with these scenes every day on social media, despite the algorithms, the pro-Israeli algorithms. It's so bad, and so many people are angered that young people are seeing it. And on the other hand, the older Republican Americans, which are the base of the Israeli regime, they're old, and they're bound to decrease in number as time goes by. So you see the percentage of people growing hostile towards the regime growing. You see the entrenchment of that anger. So the degree of hostility is growing. This does not bode well at all for the regime. I can't say at all that whether this is going to lead to some huge fracture in the near future, because at the end of the day, the political elites in the United States, the bubble in Washington, they are deeply influenced by the oligarchy, the Zionist billionaire, the billionaires, the billionaire class, the Epstein class, whatever one would like to call it. So you have the super wealthy, the powerful Zionist elite on the one hand, but you have a very angry, often and dissatisfied population that is increasingly moving hostile. Where that takes the United States is difficult to say, but I think that if this shift had not taken place, it would have been more difficult for Trump to push back on Netanyahu. In other words, if this war had happened without the 2.5 years to 3 years of genocide, and Trump was in this difficult position with this energy crisis, I think it would have been much more difficult for him to push back. But now when the political class sees how hated this Israeli regime is, it makes this pushback easier, if I'm making my point clear. So none of this is good for the Israeli regime. The language that Trump remember, every time in the past when they would put something out about differences between Biden and Netanyahu over the genocide, it turned out to be a lie. Or Trump and Netanyahu over the Iran war last year, but around now, a few days ago last year. They were saying that Trump didn't want war. He wanted negotiations. Netanyahu wanted war. And then they carried out this blitzkrieg attack. That turned out to be a lie. And then initially when these outbursts by Trump began to leak, the first one saying that everyone hates Israel, everyone hates you, and he used the F word. There was a debate about whether this was just good cop, bad cop, how real this was. But then it became, we had more instances. And then even Vance made some comments about Israel, the Israeli regime, that obviously do not look good for the regime. So while I don't want to say at all that Zionism is dead, that's obviously not the case. They are extraordinarily powerful, and they can wreck this agreement at any moment. It's possible. And I wouldn't put a false flag operation. I mean, I would not discount. I would not ignore the possibility of a false flag operation in the United States in order to mobilize the American public against Iran to pursue pro-Israeli policies. But I think that in any case, Zionism has been badly weakened in the United States, in the West, and across the world. And I think that is going to have implications in the months and years ahead. And if the genocidal actions of the Israeli regime continue, I think it's going to act as a catalyst to quicken the pace of this shift at the bottom, at the base, and it's going to have implications at the top ultimately in one form or another. And of course, the economic hardship that we're all going to experience soon based upon what we're being told due to the shortages of fuel that will hit whether the Strait of Hormuz is open or not. If it's closed, it's just going to hit harder and it's going to be longer. But I think in the months ahead, as life gets more difficult for many people, it's also going to be bad news for the Israeli regime. So the road ahead does not look good for Zionism. The road ahead does not look good for the Israeli regime. And I think ultimately this regime cannot sustain itself in the distant future. But no, we cannot underestimate the oligarchy that owns the major AI companies, that owns social media, and the mainstream media. They are owned and controlled by the Zionists. So it's going to be very complicated. But I am not optimistic about the deal, but I am optimistic about the future. I think there'll be dark days and months ahead, as I've always believed, and perhaps years. But I see the collapse of the empire taking place, unfolding in front of our eyes. And the collapse of the empire basically means the collapse of the power of the Zionist regime, because it needs Western public support, which it doesn't have. And it needs Western wealth and power to sustain itself, which is increasingly scarce. And thus, I think the internal strife in the Israeli regime is justified, and the deep concerns are justified too. And these are not good signs for their future.